Hello and welcome to this Elizabethan's practice exam walkthrough. So the exam is 1 hour 45 minutes. You can do this alongside people's health and the total mark for the paper is 80. Now this just gives you an overview of how to answer all the different questions on Elizabethan, so you can pause this and just get those kind of like final messages for how you want to answer the questions. But we're just going to walk through a paper now so we can have a look at some of the different ways in which you can answer these questions. So we're going to start off by looking at question 6A and 6B. It's really important to get your exam technique correct for these two questions. If you can do that, these questions are relatively straightforward. Okay, so for question 6, you need to read a historical interpretation. There's two questions to answer, a part A and a part B. So 6A, we're going to look at the question interpretation A. The illustrator portrays how an Elizabethan noblewoman tried to impress guests. Identify and explain one way in which she does this. And 6B, if you were asked to do further research on one aspect of interpretation A, what would you choose to investigate? Explain how this would help us analyse and understand the nature of Elizabethan society. So this is interpretation A. It's an illustration by Peter Urmston, drawn for the organisation Historic England. It shows Bess of Hardwick, the Countess of Shrewsbury, entertaining guests in the Great Chamber at Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire in 1590. So if you have a look at this question, you need to highlight the impression the interpretation gives you, which is that it portrays how an Elizabethan noblewoman tried to impress guests. You need to identify and explain. Now, one tip for this is to really try and focus on the technique the illustrator uses. So why do they choose certain things within the illustration? Or if it's a written interpretation, why have they chosen certain words? So you want to be looking out for the interpretation. Actually label this in the exam. So highlight words or label if it's a picture interpretation, how is she trying to impress her guests? These might be some of the things that you might see. The glass in the windows, probably remember Hardwick Hall, more glass than wall. A large and richly decorated room. We've got tapestries, we've got wood panelling. The fact that she's sitting at a top table, a coat of arms on the wall, there's dancing, there's music playing, for example. So this all creates that scene of showing off her wealth. So how this would look in an exam, basically you want to write 3 sentences. So you want to identify how the illustrator puts across the view given in the question, and then explain and elaborate how do they put across this view, focus on technique. So this would be an example answer, and note that it has 3 sentences. So the illustrator has shown a large and richly decorated room. The illustrator has included elaborate carvings, panellings and tapestries on the wall. These items would have been very expensive, and so by including these in the portrait, the illustrator deliberately shows how she impressed her guests through her wealth. And that is basically how to do that question. So very much think about technique and make sure you write 3 sentences. Question 6B, if you are asked to do further research on one aspect of interpretation A, what would you choose to investigate? Explain how this would help us analyse and understand the nature of Elizabethan society. So the top tip to this question, you need to begin by explaining what impression you get from interpretation A. Use your answer in 6A to help you. What are you going to inquire into? What are you going to research into? And what would that question be? And that must be a good historical question linked to a second order concept like cause, consequence, change, continuity, similarity and difference. And then crucially, how would it help a historian to find out more, and in this case, as it says in the question, about the nature of Elizabethan society? So it must link into Elizabethan society. So here's an example answer. Interpretation A gives us the impression that Elizabethan noblewomen like Bess of Hardwick enjoyed a life of luxury. I would like to do some research, so we're going to use that word, on comparing the lives of wealthy women like Bess of Hardwick to the lives of poorer women and see how different they were. I would ask the question, how different were the lives of Elizabethan noblewomen to poor women? So you want to actually pose that question. The reason why you want to do that in the exam is because that's just going to help you to be really clear on whether you've asked a really good question. Now, because it's got the word how different in there, that links to similarity and difference. So that's a great example of a question to have picked. Then the last bit, this would help a historian to understand the challenges faced by poorer women, which Bess of Hardwick would not have faced, and to judge the differences within Elizabethan society. And note that we link to Elizabethan society because that's what the question asks us to do. So top tip, make sure you are focusing on an area of further research and asking a good historical question. Okay, we're going to go on to question 7 now and have a look at this. Now for question 7, you need to read 2 historical interpretations and you need to explain the following: how far they differ, but also what might explain the differences. So the question we're going to look at is about Elizabethan family life. This topic's never come up actually. Interpretations B and C both focus on Elizabethan family life. How far do they differ and what might explain any differences? So you're going to read the interpretation carefully and you're going to try and pick out some key phrases from the interpretation. So it's from Family Life in Shakespeare's Time, an online resource for American schools by Joseph Papp and Elizabeth Kirkland, 2003. If you woke up one morning and suddenly found yourself in a 16th century family, you might be surprised at how familiar everything seemed. Although you would be getting off a lumpy straw mattress and planting your feet on a floor covered with rushes instead of rugs, when you went downstairs you would find a very modern looking family, mother, father and a few sisters and brothers, sitting on stools around the breakfast table drinking their morning beer, well, that might be different, and eating their bread and butter before getting on with the day's work. Now you want to be thinking, what's the overall impression? Now this gives a fairly positive view of family life, you know, making comparisons to what it's like today, giving that air of familiarity and comfort, for example. So they're trying to present the Elizabethan family life as being, you know, not much different from family life today. Let's have a look at interpretation C. This is from a BBC television series, The Time Traveller's Guide to Elizabethan England, written and presented by the historian Ian Mortimer. Here Mortimer is focused on the lives of the poor in Elizabethan times. Imagine you've come to stay with one of your ancestors in the 1560s. It's not unusual to find 7 or even 8 people living in a house like this. The thing that will strike you most is that it's very dark. You'll find it's very basic, just one room with an earth floor, but what will really hit you is the thick smoke filling the whole room. Candles, you think, are the obvious answer, but candles are expensive and poor families simply can't afford lots of light. This family's own possessions are a few pots, some spoons and ladles, a basket and a bench. So this overall impression you get is that Elizabethan family life is very different to family life today, and that people lived lives of poverty. It doesn't give a very positive impression of Elizabethan family life at all. So in terms of how to structure your answer, paragraph 1 is how they differ. You need to really compare them. Use phrases like on the other hand, similarly, in contrast, this is different. Interpretation B suggests, whereas interpretation C suggests. And then separate paragraph for why the interpretations differ. Look at the provenance, like where the sources come from, and in particular, write about purpose and audience. That's the key thing to explain why they differ, because they've got a different purpose and a different audience, and they'll always give you some clues to that in the actual interpretations, which you need to use as part of your answer. So in paragraph 1, you're just going to explain how the interpretations differ, focusing on overall impression that you get. Support with quotes from the interpretations. So here's an example answer, we'll just read it. The overall impression of both interpretations is very different. B suggests that Elizabethan family life is very similar to family life today, stating how familiar everything seemed and suggesting it was positive, eating their bread and butter before getting on with the day's work. It gives a positive and wholesome view of family life, but interpretation C is very different, as it suggests life as negative and that people suffered from poverty. It's not unusual to find 7 or even 8 people living in a house like this. Furthermore, C differs from B when it describes a family life of utter poverty, just one room, and poor families simply can't afford lots of light. Therefore, overall, the 2 interpretations give a very different view of Elizabethan family life, with B suggesting that family life was positive, whereas C suggesting it was negative. So we're just looking at an example answer for why the interpretations differ. So the reason why the interpretations differ is because of their purpose. B is made for an American audience, and its purpose is to focus on family life in Shakespeare's time, suggesting it's perhaps giving a more rose-tinted view of Elizabethan family life for the American audience. The purpose of interpretation C is to focus on the lives of the poor, who lived a more difficult life than the wealthy, who may be linked to the world of Shakespeare. The purpose of Ian Mortimer is to give a more accurate portrayal of Elizabethan family life within a poor family. His audience is perhaps more for people who are interested in knowing more about the realities of life in an Elizabethan poor family for a BBC series. On the other hand, the purpose of interpretation B is to give a broader and perhaps an idealised portrayal of Elizabethan family life, perhaps focusing on the idea of a Shakespearean golden age. Therefore, the interpretations differ due to their different focus and audience. So the key thing for paragraph 2 is to get that purpose and audience in there for why the interpretations differ. So we're now going to look at the essay questions, question 8 and 9. Now, generically, in terms of how to answer Elizabethans, make sure you decode the question really carefully for this one. Make a quick plan. You've got your 4 well-explained arguments that you need, 4 well-explained paragraphs, and each paragraph should include a claim. So be really clear for each paragraph whether you agree or disagree. Support that with some evidence and explanation, and then at the end of each paragraph, link back to the question, and then finish with the conclusion. And you can see on the right-hand side there how the mark scheme works for Elizabethans. So a reminder for the 20 marker, you've got a choice between question 8 or question 9. So here, question 8 is, according to the historian Alan Farmer, the rise in witchcraft accusations was due to village tensions, religious beliefs, and the impact of catastrophes like crop failures. How far do you agree with this interpretation of the cause of the rise of witchcraft accusations? And in question 9, according to an article in the online newspaper International Business Times, the actions of Elizabethan adventurers were characterised by robbery and violence. How far do you agree with this interpretation of the actions of Elizabethan adventurers? So if you're doing question 8, you need to decode the question carefully. Remember to highlight what it's asking you to do, and you really need to hang on that historian's interpretation and be able to quote that interpretation back within your essay. So we'll have a little look at an example answer for this question now. Okay, so we'll start off by looking at example paragraph to agree with this question. So we might say, and remember, you always want to start off by saying, I agree, I disagree, having the evidence to back that up, and then at the end linking back to the question. And those purple highlights there just kind of show you where you're going to start by linking really into the question, and then at the end of each paragraph, using a phrase like this shows that, or therefore, you're going to link back into the question. So let's have a look at the example paragraph. In some ways, I agree, because witchcraft accusations were partly caused by religious beliefs. For example, the rise in the Puritans led to an increase in witchcraft accusations. Puritans believed in the idea of the devil and thought witches were associated with the devil, and even regarded that witches could be temptresses to make people do immoral things. Strong evidence for this link is the fact that in areas where there were lots of Puritans, there were more witchcraft accusations, like Essex. Therefore, this shows that the religious beliefs of the Puritans were a key cause of the rise in witchcraft accusations. Okay, so thinking about how the essay would go through, we could also agree by talking about village tensions, and we could use the argument of Ursula Kemp for that. So you could say, in addition, I would agree with Alan Farmer that village tensions were a key cause in the rise of witchcraft accusations. One example that shows this is the case of Ursula Kemp in the village of St Osyth in Essex. Ursula Kemp was an Elizabethan wise woman who offered cures to local people. However, she fell out with a neighbour in a village called Grace Thurlow. Ursula had once helped Grace by curing her child of illness using folk remedies. However, the two later argued, and after their falling out, Grace Thurlow accused Ursula of bewitching her and causing harm. Specifically, that Ursula's familiars, witches' spirits, had lamed Thurlow and made her ill. This was a very typical case of a witchcraft accusation, showing that village tensions, especially linked to Elizabethan wise women, was often a reason for witchcraft accusations. A third degree might be around crop failures. We won't read this whole one, but the fact that a lack of scientific understanding meant that when there was some kind of crisis, like the poor harvest in the mid-1590s, people would often blame witches for things like crop failures. Also, urbanisation meant that many of the women accused of witchcraft were isolated within their villages, because many of their perhaps wider family had moved from the countryside to the towns to look for work. So that urbanisation kind of combined with that sense of isolation, and when there was a catastrophe that happened, often these women, they're often poor elderly women, were scapegoated. Obviously, a disagree for this would be about misogyny and the fact that 80% of those accused of witchcraft were women. You could bring in the ideas of the historian like Marianne Hester, who's talked about how misogyny is a key driving factor for this as well. So that's how you would answer a question on the causes of the rise in witchcraft accusations during the Elizabethan era. Okay, the final question we're going to look at is this idea of the Elizabethan adventurers. According to an article in the online newspaper International Business Times, the actions of Elizabethan adventurers were characterised by robbery and violence. How far do you agree with this interpretation of the actions of Elizabethan adventurers? So obviously the key thing here is to think about those Elizabethan adventurers you've looked at and think about what is the evidence that their actions are characterised by robbery and violence, but obviously you're going to need a disagree with this. So you need to know your Elizabethan adventurers well, know what they did, what motivated them, for example, and what actions they actually took. So we just read one agree paragraph for this. In some ways I agree, because the actions of Elizabethan adventurers were characterised by robbery and violence. One example would be Francis Drake. On his circumnavigation 1577 to 1580, he stole lots of treasure from the Spanish off the coast of South America and then brought this back to England in 1580, where the loot was taken to the Tower of London. Drake continued to raid Spanish treasure ships throughout the 1580s. The Spanish began to refer to him as El Drake and even put a reward out for his head. This shows that he was regarded as someone responsible for robbery and violence. Okay, another agree would be about the Roanoke colony. So in addition, I would agree with this view that the actions of Elizabethan adventurers were characterised by violence due to what happened at Roanoke in 1585. Walter Raleigh organised the colonisation of Roanoke. Initially, relations between the English and indigenous peoples were peaceful, with mutual trade and cooperation. However, tensions grew as English demands for food and resources increased. In 1586, the English under Sir Ralph Lane became suspicious of the chief of the Second tribe called Wingina. They accused him of plotting against them. Rather than seeking diplomacy, the English responded with brutal force and launched a violent surprise attack and beheaded Wingina, displaying his head on a stake. This shows that actions of Elizabethan adventurers were often characterised by violence. Now, we won't read all the other ones, but if you're looking for a disagree, then you're going to bring in the idea of trade, and Ralph Fitch and James Lancaster. They're not characterised by robbery and violence. Ralph Fitch, for example, is very much creating links with India, Mughal India, for example. And another disagree might be Walter Raleigh's voyage to Guyana, which is very much driven by exploration and the pursuit of wealth, for example. So that would be another one to be aware of. And the fact he did establish friendly relationships, improved exploration, that type of thing. Other examples you could talk about for this, you could talk about John Dee's ideas about setting up a British Empire, so very much motivated by colonisation. That's very much seen through the ideas of Humphrey Gilbert, for example, when he goes to Newfoundland. He's trying to set up a colony in Newfoundland, make himself wealthy, for example. So there's lots and lots of ideas that you can get for this question. Thanks very much for listening to this practice exam walkthrough. I hope you found that useful and interesting, and good luck with your exams.